Okay, so how do you do a brain energy rescue? Why is it important to you? Why should you care about it? Will you ever use it? That's today. Okay, to reverse cognitive decline, that's the motivation that I'm going to try to give you so you actually learn how to do this and you take it seriously. Some of this you've heard before, no doubt. All right, I want to put a finer point on how to achieve a brain energy rescue. And that's a term that's nearing about 20 years old when you really do all the research, but it's become more and more popular really over the last 3 or 4 years, brain energy rescue. Okay, here's what we're going to do now. We're going to elaborate on, in essence, ketosis, how to use it, how to get into it, why it's important, some of the history of it. And I think that's the big deal. If you get the context of when this started to become gradually recognized as being a big deal. I don't just mean having a fat coffee and getting on with your life. Okay, and then we'll go further on it in the subsequent videos. All right, disclaimer. This is not for advanced cognitive decline impaired individuals. It's just if it's a lot of organic atrophy, we just can't work with it. It's just not going to be relevant. How do we do this? Ketosis, omega-3 and B vitamins, and choline. Those are the 3 steps. We're just talking about step 1 because you need to get this down. And I'll show you how important this is. Don't skip it and go, I want to do the fun stuff like the choline. What supplements are you going to recommend? And why is that a good thing? You know, if you don't have the right fuel for your brain, it really doesn't matter what you're giving it otherwise. 3 levels to it. The foundation is brain energy rescue, which is the fuel, is being metabolically fluid. The second is the structure, right, of any building. We're going to be using the analogy of a house. And last is the electricity and the plumbing, if you want to think of it that way. So, creating, maintaining, or restoring cognitive health. So whether you're a young adult, whether you're an adolescent, that you know that you're cognitively impaired, or let me rephrase it another way. When I was in college, when I was really, and even certainly medical school, and you just felt you had to focus on absorbing a lot of information, I would have definitely paid attention to this. I wouldn't just use supplements. I'd say, I need to know about how to stay into ketosis for my brain, and I would build it exactly this way for those reasons. As you get older and you find your parents or your grandparents or maybe yourself, you're starting to forget a few things. Where'd you put the car keys? Who was that called you and talked to you this afternoon? What did you see on TV last night? Et cetera, et cetera. Do you remember what you had for breakfast? And there's others, more academic ways of measuring out your cognitive decline, for sure. It's a whole academic specialty now, medical specialty as well. So you need to have a solid foundation in which to burn both glucose and ketones as your fuel. So 3 vital components are foundation, ability to make ketones and use ketones. The framing has to be perfect. That's step 2. Obviously, that's the house. It has to be solid. It has to be true, as in perpendicular and so on. And if these 2 are not in sync together, built together, it doesn't matter what you put on top of it, which will be, it doesn't matter how you do the wiring, it doesn't matter how you do the plumbing, because you have a crummy foundation and you have a poor framing, poor structure. So that's why we're taking these sequentially. Okay, optimal foundation for your cognitive function is your ability to be in ketosis. In other words, low carbs and you might say high fat or not high fat. There's a big discrepancy and we'll get into it. So your source of energy for the brain cannot be glucose dependent. Can't be glucose dependent. Some glucose is used all the time. So it's not like, oh, you're going to be so focused on using ketones. No, you're being focused on being metabolically flexible. But before you get to that stage, which is a big transition, it's taking the smaller steps to learn to help your body get into a metabolically nutritional ketosis. Okay, if this doesn't happen because you are consuming only carbs, your brain will begin to crumble gradually, year by year. And this is what that looks like. Cognitive decline, and this is what a PET scan looks like. PET scans are basically your glucose uptake. And your glucose uptake shows the active part of your brain. And so PET scans are now used. They really came out of the 1980s and going forward. Suddenly you got to see what parts of the brains were actually functional. So from that, you now have images which are pretty representative of what a normal brain looks like. This is where the glucose is taken up. And the darker areas, there's no activity at all. So that's where these cracks are. That's the atrophy of the brain. So your brain loses its ability to use glucose for fuel. Small cracks go to bigger cracks. Okay, so Alzheimer's type 3, Or what I like is better, it's the diabetes of the brain. These PET scans that started coming out of around 2000, where that was kind of the default way of looking at, oh my gosh, look at all these people that have cognitive decline, and we get to see it in their brain. There was now a big connection there. So what they associated with, and if you're using PET scan, the obvious thing is it's associated with glucose uptake. If there's no glucose uptake, it's dark blue, there's a problem. May be present decades before symptoms appear. Decades before symptoms appear in people at risk for Alzheimer's as early as their 20s. So this is where type 3 diabetes was coined at this particular study in 2004 from Brown University. What's interesting is basically this, is that they go, oh my gosh, look at this, it's like this epiphany of it has to do with glucose and insulin resistance and so on and so forth. The reason there was this epiphany, and I'll show you that it was not a new idea. I mean, they coined it type 3 diabetes, or I think diabetes of the brain is better, is because people who had to go to the hospital, go to their doctor to get examined for cognitive decline and have all these cognitive tests were not also looked at for blood sugar. So they didn't do fasting insulin, they didn't do fasting glucose, they certainly didn't do the Kraft's test, to basically a glucose tolerance test over time. They didn't think of that. They were just separate patient populations. Oh, you're here for cognitive decline or cognitive mapping? All right, we'll do that. And so it was like, wow, look at that. So I'll show you, but the idea was pretty old, fairly old. So I want to map this out, and this is from a study in 2020, so pretty recent. This is Dr. Cunane's team up at Sherbrooke University in Quebec. And these are the SNPs that are involved, that some of what presenilin, ApoE, family history of Alzheimer's disease if you're over 60, aging over 60 years old, insulin resistance if over 25 years old. So the point here is that you have this energy gap. Your brain is not getting what it needs. You're not manifesting clear cognitive deficiencies yet, but some of the symptoms, you go through bouts of not remembering and not being able to have, if you were to measure your acetylcholine, not enough. So this gap here, this gap of you start to have the energy gap, and this is what that means: mitochondrial dysfunction, axonal and synaptic disruption. Basically, the nerves are breaking down. Loss of glial support, fancy word, apoptosis, it's dying. Your brain nerves are dying, and other cells in your brain are dying. Brain atrophy and plaques and tangles that are part of Alzheimer's disease. But here you have the clinical symptoms. Here is not clinical symptoms. So this is the big intervention here. Here's another way of looking at it. This is actually measured. And Dr. Cunane has a number of studies on this, and I love how it's mapped out. This gray box in the background here is basically, if you are below this gray area, you are expressing clinical symptoms. So right here, you are, this area here, below the gray box, you are clearly, can't remember, you're stuck sort of groping. You might even have communication problems. If you're above it, you're doing okay. And here, the orange are ketones, right? And the dark blue area, energy contribution from glucose. You can see with time, from healthy young adults to cognitively healthy older adults, just the aging factor, you're using less glucose. It's not because you want to use less glucose, it's because you can't use more glucose. Your ability is being impaired. And then you go on to people with mild cognitive impairment, MCI, and then people with Alzheimer's, they are below that gray box, even with the use of ketones, okay? So we are looking at that brain energy gap, and we're trying to make up the difference. And the most possible way to make up that difference is using ketones. Yeah, you can use a product, but I'm not suggesting you do that. Learning to make them and encouraging your body to make them is the best way, because it has so many other purposes as well, okay? And here's like, all cells and neurons in the brain are effective. It's not just your nerve cells, which is this one, your astrocytes, your oligodendrocytes, your microglia. So it's the whole brain that's being affected. So now, nearly 20 years later from that study at Brown, it is still being confirmed. Here's now 2022. It says Alzheimer's disease is type 3 diabetes. Right now it's using that term. Common pathophysiology mechanism between Alzheimer's and type 2 diabetes. And I sort of summarized it briefly, and it said, all right, the connection is, these are linked, right? Alzheimer's and type 2 diabetes are interlinked with insulin resistance, neuroinflammation, oxidative stress, advanced glycosylation end products, or what they call AGEs. That's when you overcook your meat on a grill, that's where you get AGEs. Mitochondrial dysfunction, metabolic syndrome, which is pretty much all the same thing. The beta amyloid, tau proteins are found both in diabetics as well as Alzheimer's. So now they're realizing, oh, there's a common symptomology in both patient populations. They're making this connection. Before they didn't, because you just had endocrinologists that treated diabetics, right? And then you had neurosurgeons and neurologists that treated those with cognitive decline. Different doctors, different populations. So the type 2 diabetes patients are not evaluated for cognitive status. So they were never treated for cognitive impairment, even though they had it. Alzheimer's patients were not evaluated for dysglycemia, for diabetes, like high insulin or glucose, or even the Kraft's glucose tolerance test, as we talked about. Therefore, it's suggested that Alzheimer's is a metabolic disease. Where else did you hear that? Remember cancer as a metabolic disease with Dr. Thomas Siegfried up at Boston University? Anyway, so the metabolic disease, as with the cancer, it's caused by insulin resistance in the brain, and therefore it should be referred to as type 3 diabetes. Okay, brain energy rescue. Is ketones, they bypass the fundamental problem of getting glucose into the brain by providing an alternative fuel. So here's what we're looking at, metabolic flexibility. You have glucose. Glucose is going to be this special energy box that you're going to use in terms of high stress, which should be like an emergency. I'm really stressed. Oh my gosh, I forgot about that. I owed $5 million to somebody. That would stress me, right? Or there's a bear after me and I got to run for my life. That would stress me. That's a glucose event. But if I'm just sitting here thinking and working, I'm mostly in a ketosis. I'm mostly burning fat. And so these are the two, I think of a car if you want to. I'm going fast, got to use gas. But if I'm just going regularly, I can use fat. Okay, so, but what I also want you to know is glucose goes into the brain. It's gated. It goes into the brain cells with permission. In other words, it has to go to certain receptors. Insulin's there to say, all right, open up the door, glucose goes in. If the receptors don't open, glucose can't go in. And that's what happens over time. More and more of the receptors don't open. And so it's not that you don't have the glucose, it's that less and less glucose is being allowed to come into the brain. And the brain starves from glucose, hypometabolism. However, ketones are all about concentration gradient. If there is a certain percentage in your blood, that's fine. It's going to come in. It's going to flood the brain cells, if you will, little by little. Two different mechanisms getting into the brain cell. Notice, ketones through fasting. So fasting means multiple days, intermittent fasting, ketogenic diet, of course, MCT oils, medium chain triglycerides. So brain cells can burn both, glucose and ketones. But wait! Where did this idea first come from? Where did it first originate? Connecting the idea of cognitive decline with metabolic disorders, with reduced neuronal metabolism. So cognitive decline with a metabolic disorder of reduced neuronal metabolism. It began in 1984. So Alzheimer's disease, a metabolic system degeneration. So there was a guy, and his name is Dr. Bass. Actually, there was a couple of them, Finnegan and Bass. They worked together, and there's a number of studies about this time that came out saying Alzheimer's disease can be considered a late onset system degeneration. And it goes, characteristically involving certain populations of cholinergic, think of acetylcholine, neurons, but eventually involving other cells as well. Decrease in cerebral metabolic rate, which is what we're talking about. It may reflect not only decreased neuronal activity, but also deficiencies in metabolic enzymes. Think of neurotransmitters. Okay? Pretty interesting. So 1984. So that's roughly 20 years before that study in 2004 at Brown. They call it type 3 diabetes. So it was an old concept. Enter this guy named Samuel T. Henderson from the University of Chicago. He's a professor there. And he was looking on metabolic energy and how to work with turning back cognitive decline in various conditions. Hyponutrition. And this is really fascinating. This guy went all in. He studied this, probably because he was just interested, and he ended up making a slew of products about this. He combined it to being an entrepreneur, but primarily he was a professor. So, High Carbohydrate Diets and Alzheimer's Disease, 2003. So this is before the Brown study. And basically, what did it say? It said this Alzheimer's is a common progressive neurodegenerative disease that primarily affects the elderly. A well-defined risk factor for late-onset Alzheimer's is possession of one or more alleles of ApoE4. So we're saying ApoE4, which is a SNP, 4 actually, the variant is E4, is a problem. Those who have that have a high risk of Alzheimer's. And we're going to learn about this. Hold on. So what we find is that ApoE is rare in populations with a historical exposure to agriculture. I'll show you a map in a second. And what we see is those from the Middle East or the Mediterranean they don't have this allele. And there's really only 5% of the human population that has this. So suggesting that a population consuming a high carbohydrate diet may have selected against ApoE4, right? So the Mediterranean diet, if you think of all the wheat that comes from Egypt, and so they are agricultural. And so the Fertile Crescent, it came from the Tigris and the Euphrates, the Middle East. This is where agricultural started about 10 to 14,000 years ago. They don't have this. So the evolutionarily discordant high-carb diets are thought to be the primary cause of Alzheimer's diseases for 2 reasons. So high carbs are the cause. High carbs are the cause for Alzheimer's disease for 2 reasons. 1, disturbances in lipid metabolism with the central nervous system inhibits the function of membranes. Okay, so what we're saying is your ability to burn fats is shutting down your ability to connect with these receptors and open up and use glucose in your brain. The second is prolonged excessive insulin and insulin-like growth factor signaling accelerates cellular damage in cerebral neurons. So chronically high insulin, because you've had chronically high glucose, and a thing called insulin-like glucose factor, which is used as a surrogate sometimes for growth hormone, is that these are chronically elevated and they start shutting down the ability to open those gates to all the brain cells, the nerve cells, and the other ones, the astrocytes, etc. So these 2 factors ultimately lead to the clinical and pathological course of Alzheimer's disease. So here we go. Remember, we're talking about Sam Henderson, Dr. Sam Henderson. The hypothesis suggests 2 preventative and treatment strategies. So what we're saying is if you buy this way of looking at it, if you buy the idea that ApoE4 is all about a hypersensitivity, I'm using my words, a hypersensitivity to carbs, then that means for ApoE4 people, or maybe Alzheimer's in general, you give them a low-carb diet. Potentially a higher fat, but a low-carb diet. And that will drop the risk. So these SNPs were at high risk factor. You're now taking the risk down by taking the carbs out of their diet. Decreasing dietary carbohydrates, and the second is increasing essential fatty acids. That would be your omega-3s, DHEA, DHA, and EPA. So interventions that restore lipid homeostasis, brain fat, may treat the disease, increase the fatty acid metabolism, and EFA, essential fatty acids repletion, and ketone body treatment. All right, here's a picture of it. This is really interesting. So here's the idea of, the white is, there is no association. Those from these countries, now we're all from everybody's, right? We're all over the world, and people who are Turkish don't live in Turkey, they live elsewhere as well, and vice versa. But primarily, these ancestral homes, areas of the world, have the lowest rates of E4. In fact, they don't have E44 at all. And so as you go north, so this is high carb country. High carb country is the Mediterranean, it's the Middle East, there's a Fertile Crescent is over here. As you go north, and you could say that these arrows represent the migration, what they call the Neolithic farmers from the Middle East along the Mediterranean. So they went from the Middle East out through the Mediterranean, out through the Gibraltar and into the Atlantic Ocean. So this stripe here represents the migration back in the 10 or 12, 14,000 years ago. But as you go north, E4 starts to become more popular. There's Sweden and there's Finland. So you have the highest. And if you were to go further, I don't know what the Inuit relation is, but it makes perfect sense. What do Inuits have? As you live further north, you don't have either access to carbs because it's all snow, you are a fat eater by default. So the Inuits, think of the perfect world, not how they're eating today. They're eating blubber and animals. So they are animal and fat, high animal and fat diet, not high carbs. Makes perfect sense as you go that way. So the distribution of ApoE4 is 0 here and very high there. So the highest 10 to 15 to 30% is Finland and Sweden. But as a population, as the human population in general, ApoE4 is just 5%. Interesting, huh? So the question is it really a problem? It's a problem in a high carb diet. So it is a problem for ApoE4 in the context of the modern diet, what they call a Western diet. But if you go back a couple hundred years ago, they didn't have that problem because there wasn't a lot of carbs to have. So therefore, the problem wasn't there. They weren't eating a riskier diet. So it didn't matter that they're E4. But now that most people eat a lot of carbs, and it's mostly processed carbs or refined carbs. Okay, an example of patents using MCT to address conditions due to cognitive decline. So here's Dr. Samuel Henderson, the University of Colorado. One of the patents, he ended up getting about 30 patents. He looked at this problem, he goes, wow, there's a lot you can treat here. Just bear with me and you'll see this guy was very smart. And he actually opened up the whole world about this. So he had one of his 30 patents, a combination of MCT oil, MCT, and therapeutic agents, whatever they are. And they're treating any condition that results from reduced neuronal metabolism. Reduced neuronal metabolism. Say that to yourself again. Reduced neuronal metabolism, which basically means your nerves can't take in glucose. They have a reduced metabolism in a high carb world. So there's a lot of conditions. Suddenly it's like, well, look at the market of conditions that have reduced neuronal metabolism. So he just said he made MCT, he rebranded it, if you will, and said, no, it's a medical food. And he actually got a patent for MCT oil as a medical food. I don't know how he did that, but he did it. Here was one of the first patents he had in 2001. And it's for conditions this is his market, for conditions arising from reduced neuronal metabolism. Conditions arising from reduced neuronal metabolism and leading to a lessened cognitive function. Pretty straightforward. And you go, and you say, wow, what cognitive decline? It's bigger than that, way bigger than that. Okay, and that was in 2001. You can learn a lot by looking at all these different patents from a different perspective, because when you take out a patent, you have to say, how is this thing special? And, what is the unmet need is what they say. What audience are you addressing? What is the unmet need that you can satisfy? What is this product? Is the product safe? It doesn't have to be FDA approved. You're trying to get a patent to make it special so other people can't do what you do. But when you have to present your claims, it sort of reveals a lot of research on your part, and that's what I want to show you. So here is the beginning of 30 patents that Samuel Johnson started from 2001. Here we go. Use of medium-chain triglycerides for the treatment of Alzheimer's and other diseases from reduced neuronal metabolism. Next one. Drug targets for Alzheimer's disease and other diseases associated with decreased neuronal metabolism. We're talking about inability to use glucose in neurons. So it's all the same thing. Now we're in 2004, use of MCT oil for treatment and prevention of Alzheimer's disease and other diseases resulting from reduced neuronal metabolism. It goes on. And now we go, use of ketone compounds for treating age-associated memory impairment. Still, we're just talking about MCT oil. And this is 2008. And let's look at the line. It says, for prevention of loss of cognitive function caused by reduced neuronal metabolism. Next one, synthesis of, now there's slightly still, it's about, these are ketone esters, pretty much MCT oil. So it says, for the presence, incapable, so basically I'm looking for the line that says reduced, and for reduced neuronal metabolism. There we go. Again, reduced for method for reducing levels of disease associated with proteins in reduced neuronal metabolism. Method to reduce oxidative damage by administration of MCT oil. 2010, still just MCT oil. Compositions and methods for preserving brain function. And so these are all around the idea of MCT oil, and on and on. And there's another 20 pages. I just wanted to go through and show you this because it gives you a context of how powerful this is that they're making medical food. So the idea, if you make medical food, it has to be prescription only. So you're not going to get this OTC over the counter. Medium, here we are now in 2017, use of MCT for the treatment and prevention of Alzheimer's disease and other diseases resulting from reduced neuronal metabolism. Use of genomic testing. So they're looking at ApoE4 and presenilin, things we've already looked at. So just wanted to show you that there's a number of patents all based around MCT oil. So here's how big the market, if you will, if you think that way, it is for reduced neuronal metabolism. So it's not just cognitively impaired or thinking about Alzheimer's or dementia. It's far bigger than that. Here's just a short list of it, and you can go on from there, but here's the list. Age-associated memory impairment, of course, that's what most people think of, right? Or MCI, mild cognitive impairment. Alzheimer's disease, of course. Parkinson's disease, of course. Friedreich's ataxia, maybe some of you haven't heard of that. GLUT1 deficient epilepsy, that is a gated window to getting glucose into the brain, right? That's a shutdown for epilepsy. Leprechaunism and the Rabson-Mendenhall syndrome. Coronary arterial bypass graft dementia, called CABG. Anesthesia-induced memory loss. Huntington's disease, Huntington's chorea. ALS, and others. So all of these have to do with reduced neuronal metabolism. All of these have to do with decreased ability to use glucose as a fuel. Consequently, they are hypofunctioning. They have all those things we've talked about. So that's how big this market is. So this guy, Stephen Henderson, the reason to focus on it, he was the first one saying, oh my gosh, I'm just going to go take MCT, make some sort of patent and say I did something special to it, just patent it itself, but it's the application of. So he has to go, each one of these is now another patent. He has to go, okay, we're going to do a patent for MCT oil for AAMI, and we're going to say it's there to address reduced neuronal metabolism. Boom. Here's the research on that, which is out there. And this is going to be helpful because it helps to address ketones, which is going to fill the energy gap, which is going to make the brain energy rescue in this particular situation for these people. Amazing, huh? And so on it goes. So for the last 20 years, this is what has been used. So when you see about MCT oil, it's part of a bigger thing. It's part of ketosis. And I hope you are open to it, but I'm hoping you're open to the whole idea of using ketones to address that gap. Remember the gap that has no symptoms, which is part of the stage of the decline? How do we know that decline is there? Because now they have all these PET scans of all sorts of people with all sorts of conditions, young and old. So what is the point of all this? The MCT is so effective at helping all these conditions that are associated with reduced neuronal metabolism. You can say that to yourself almost as a mantra, i.e. they are unable to use glucose, or they can use it very poorly, as a fuel for the brain adequately. Bottom line, you need ketones. And the difference between using MCT oil versus using an estrogen or a ketone salt is you are making the ketones yourself. If you're using a ketone salt or estrogen, you're not. And so your body gets a feedback of saying, oh, I don't need ketones because I'm eating ketones. Whereas if you're eating an MCT oil, it's a triglyceride. It's C8, caprylic acid triglyceride. And it uses that to make ketones. There are plenty of research in pharmaceutical companies that know this to be true. Consequently, they're attempting to patent natural products and have them become prescription medications only. MCT oil is not a passing fad, nor is the ketogenic diet. Both are important metabolic tools used to treat reduced neuronal metabolism. Okay, MCTs are dietary supplements that can induce ketosis. This is a study from 2021, and this is from Taiwan, actually, without the need for traditional ketogenic diet or prolonged fasting. So what they did is look at all studies, hundreds of studies that have to do with MCTs relative to cognitive decline, and they put it all in and said, hey, it's adequate. I mean, it actually is effective, and it basically said, hey, here's how you use it. Here's the practical advice. Starting dose of C8. Right? MCT is medium chain triglycerides, which is primarily C8 and C10. You can argue that it's C6 to C14, but it's C8 to C10. C8 is far more ketogenic than C10. Second, MCT should be consumed after an overnight fast in the morning. You can add caffeine if you want to and get an added benefit. Emulsify it, it's even better. And this is kind of generic recommendations. 3 or 4 years ago, I interviewed somebody from the Charlie Foundation who's been using a ketogenic diet for the last 30 or 40 years for autism and other conditions, and they emulsify it. They just blend it up. Okay, so there's ketogenic effect, medium chain triglycerides. Okay, implication of physiological ketosis on the cognitive brain. Again, optimal cognitive function are necessary, and it basically breaks it down by saying glucose is the problem, it's the core bioenergy of the body. What happens when you can't use it? You need to have ketones, and so therefore, in order to promote cognitive effects and address the disease progression, you need ketones. I'm paraphrasing. They review the ketogenic approaches to produce cognitive effects, etc. And this is 2022. This just came out 3 months ago. This is how current this is. So as much as you might have heard, hey, use MCT oils, I'm putting it in a larger context and saying, there's so many studies out there now from different areas. It's not just one little lab, it's worldwide. And this is Philadelphia, Drexel University, Department of Nutrition. It's a big deal. So it says specifically used for how they're using it on healthy people, also on those with mild cognitive impairment and with Alzheimer's. MCT oil is not new. I simply put this as a Google search and look at the dates. 1966, hypoketonemia, elevated ketones in your blood. In other words, 1966, and the difference that makes with MCT oil. That's 50 years ago, 60 years ago. Wow, amazing. Okay, MCT in a completely different context. Here we go. In 1976, they're using MCT for cystic fibrosis for children. And they're saying, hey, these kids have a problem. My dad actually worked with cystic fibrosis. I didn't know enough about it, obviously, back then. And so they decided to try MCT oils with cystic fibrosis. Those are the ones that are missing an enzyme and they get very congested in their lungs and eventually die of suffocation primarily. So they're saying MCT fats, oil, should be included as a standard dietary requirement used in the management of any child with cystic fibrosis or failure to thrive. Isn't that amazing? There you go. Till next time, we're going to continue on that. I just want to say, if this is something you're really interested in, as I am, you might be really interested in following some of these videos. Take care. Till next time.